Why I don't think the addition of Malik Zaire will alter the outcome of Michigan's season opener versus Florida one iota. Next on the Michigan Podcast.
There's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it and touchdown Knight again. Schultz just before Frizzell got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wall of him, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Second. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
The MVP in today's ball game. You want to know who it is? I'm standing alongside his proud daddy, quarterback Brian Greasy of Michigan.
Howdy, welcome to another week of the Michigan Podcast. I'm Steve Deace. Pleasure having you with us. Don't forget you can subscribe right here on YouTube if you're watching the video. Please click like and subscribe. Share it with as many people as you possibly can to help us get the word out. You can follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. You can also subscribe to us via Google Play, Stitcher, iTunes as well if you want just the podcast edition. However you'd like to connect with us, we love connecting with you. Coming up later on here in this episode, Michael Spath, who's with Go Blue Wolverine, also the talk show host from WTKA Ann Arbor. He's going to join us talking about Michigan sports, but also big news from rivals in East Lansing and Columbus. That coming up later in this episode, as well as our first look ahead to the upcoming season in Big Ten basketball, now that we know who's going pro and who's not, and the vast majority of transfers have been determined. We get a pretty good look at what the rosters are going to look like heading into next winter. We'll talk about that here in just a few moments. But first, it is rapidly approaching. We are getting down now. July 31st is when Michigan opens camp. That's only about 50 some odd days from when we are taping this as they begin preparations to take on the Florida Gators in Jerry World in the season opener on September the 2nd. And the Gators got some big news this week. Now, the SEC had a rule that was probably the toughest in allowing grad transfers of all the Power 5 schools. They got together recently in Destin, Florida in their spring meetings. They lessened that rule. And now Malik Zaire, the former Notre Dame starting quarterback, will be allowed to attend in Florida as he decided about a week ago. Now, in general, I'm pretty much pro player. I think when you look at the amount of money that is being made by everybody else in this sport, and I'm a capitalist, then I understand we can't flat out pay players because of Title IX and everything else. But when it comes to player freedom and essentially allowing them to enjoy the accoutrements of what they put their bodies through and their schedules through to entertain us, I'm pretty much pro player for anything other than flat out paying them money. But I thought Malik Zaire here made a mistake. I thought you look at Texas with Tom Herman sitting there, and they've got Shane Buechele at quarterback, who's maybe a $150 soaking wet, and he wants to run that zone read, and Malik Zaire would be perfect in that system, a perfect plug-and-play. Texas returns every other kind of player you would want to be an elite college football team. They're much like the team Michigan was when Jim Harbaugh took over for Brady Hoke. Hoke had recruited well. They just didn't really have a quarterback, and they needed a culture change. Those are the same two things that Texas needs. Herman's going to bring the culture change. He still needs the quarterback. And as you look at these highlights, you watch Malik Zaire excelling, ironically, against Texas, running what? Tom Herman's style of offense. I think, especially in a Big 12 conference that doesn't play much more defense than you and I are going to play on a weekly basis, he could have lit it up down there for the Longhorns. Instead, he says, hey, I want to be a pro quarterback, so I'm going to go to an offense where they run a West Coast offense. I'm going to go to Florida. Except if you're a Michigan fan, we've seen this movie before. I know some of you are concerned. You're like, well, hey, this is like when we brought in Jake Rudock, and look what he did for us. Actually, it's not like that at all. Jake Rudock had started numerous games. In fact, he had started even his final game at Iowa in the Gator Bowl. He was a 2-year starter for the Hawkeyes. Malik Zaire really has played 3 games of significance. There, you just saw him here in the Independence Bowl back in 2014, guys. That's the 2014 Independence Bowl versus LSU when he lit them up. Albeit, though, a lot of it was because he'd never played, so there was no film, nothing to break down for him. Then you look here. This is the 2015 season opener, I believe it was, at home against Texas, where they lit up what was likely the worst Texas team in 100 years. And then the very next week, they went down to Charlottesville, Virginia. When they did have a week of film on Malik Zaire, he struggled. Notre Dame nearly lost that game to a terrible Virginia team. This young kid, many of us hadn't heard of at the time, comes in for an injured Malik Zaire named Deshaun Kaiser, throws a last-minute touchdown pass to bail the Irish out, and they went on and had a 10-win season that year. The body of work for Malik Zaire, nowhere near the body of work for Jake Rudock when he was a grad transfer. Not to mention the style of offense is dramatically different. Jake Rudock had run a pro-style system at Iowa for 4 years if you count the year he redshirted down there as well. All that was going to change going to Michigan was, one, he was going to have real receivers to throw to. That's a position for Iowa annually. They're amongst the most anemic in the Big Ten. So he was going to have real athletes to throw to. B, he was going to get better quarterback coaching with Jim Harbaugh than he was going to get in Iowa City. But other than knowing the terminology, a lot of it is exactly what he ran at the University of Iowa. Kirk Ferentz, Jim Harbaugh, both come from the NFL. They bring pro-style systems with them to college football. Wasn't that big of a leap for Jake Rudock at all. He just needed the summer for his teammates to see him as a leader. And if you'll recall in 2015, Jake Rudock's first few games, he didn't exactly light it up. In fact, that very first game against Utah, he threw 3 interceptions in that game. Really, the first game that I thought he truly led the team was when they routed BYU there. That was kind of his coming out party. But most of the great stats that Jake Rudock put up, he put up in the last 4 to 5 games of the year, except for Ohio State when he got banged up in that game. And that's really the resume that made him a 6th-round draft pick of the Detroit Lions and now their backup quarterback. Malik Zaire doesn't have anything close to that body of work. He's also going to a system, and stop me if you've heard this before, fellow Wolverine, where Doug Nussmeier is the offensive coordinator. You'll recall Doug Nussmeier was the OC hire that was going to save Brady Hoke's job back in 2014. He was the guy that was going to turn Devin Gardner loose, figure out finally how to tap into that potential we saw in 2012 when Gardner came in the last few weeks of the year for an injured Denard Robinson, and I think was Big Ten Player of the Week not once but twice, just putting up crazy numbers. Except Doug Nussmeier tried to get Devin Gardner to essentially run a pro-style offense like the one he ran when he was the OC at Alabama. It was a poor fit. So it's sitting here now. What's the date today? June 6th is the date we're recording this. Florida's going to go to camp here in about 50 days. In 50 days, are they really going to transition out of a West Coast offense in order to go to an offense that more is befitting of Malik Zaire's skill set? Now, maybe they will. You'd like to think Doug Nussmeier will learn from the mistakes he made at Michigan, and that will benefit Malik Zaire. But can they install that? Get the timing down with the receivers? The West Coast offense is a timing offense. Can they do all of that? Or even install a more of a spread look that would take advantage of Malik Zaire? Can they do all of that prior to September the 2nd? Listen, don't get me wrong. Florida's other 2 options at quarterback are Jack Del Rio's kid, Luke, who didn't really shine when he played last year before getting hurt, and 2 redshirt freshmen. One of them, Felipe Franks, I don't even think was the starting quarterback in his high school team, but was considered a top prospect. I get why they're doing this, and it buys them some time to develop those guys. And I think Malik Zaire does have a unique and potentially elite skill set if it's properly coached, developed, and in the right system. Like, I would be really worried if we were playing Florida maybe a month or two into the year. Of course, you could turn that around and saying our young defense would be a lot better a month or two into the season than it will be on September the 2nd as well. But on September the 2nd, we're bringing in, if you're Florida, you're bringing in a guy who is a completely different quarterback than the system you're currently playing, who doesn't really have a huge body of work, and you're going to go up against arguably the best defensive coordinator in college football in that opener, and you're going to overcome all of that obstacles in a few weeks, heading into two-a-days. Well, they don't do those anymore. So heading into training camp, I'm not buying it. And that's why I don't think bringing in Malik Zaire is going to alter the outcome of the Michigan-Florida game one iota. Florida may win the game. The two teams are pretty even in talent. But if they win the game, I don't think it's because Malik Zaire turned it into a sandlot and lit Michigan up. I just think it's because Florida did a better job getting their younger players ready to play that day than did Michigan.
It's big in Ohio. Well, win would really satisfy the alumni here, wouldn't it? For a week. Second down, 10. Callaway in motion. Brown back, stepping up in the pocket. Unloading down the far side and up in the end zone. It is caught for the touchdown by Colazar. Oh, my God.
And now that we have a pretty good idea of what the rosters are going to look like in the Big Ten, the NBA draft deadline has come and gone. We pretty much know, with a few exceptions, it's possible Michigan could add another player, but more than likely, the rosters for the Big Ten are pretty much set for next year's basketball season. So let's take a quick look at who has what coming back among the teams that are considered to be the top teams in the league. Let's start with the Indiana Hoosiers, and you see there Anunoby, Blackman, Bryant, Johnson, Newkirk. Those were the 5 players that led them in minutes last year. And of those 5, only Johnson and Newkirk return. Not to mention you have a new coaching staff there with Archie Miller. In fact, there's only, 4 or 5 Big Ten teams that brought in top 40 recruiting classes. So that's going to be a tough ask, a heavy lift for Indiana in Archie Miller's very first year. The next team we'll take a look at, the Iowa Hawkeyes. Bear, Bohannon, Cook, Jock, Pemsel. That was last year's starting 5. Of those 5 players, 4 return. Bear, Bohannon, Tyler Cook, who I think has the potential to take a huge leap next year, a Caleb Swanigan type of a leap, and Pemsel. And the thing about Iowa as well, they led the Big Ten last year in minutes and points scored by freshmen. And all those guys are back, and they're also one of the few schools in the Big Ten with, according to ESPN, a top 40 recruiting class coming in. Next, let's take a look at Maryland. Cowan, Dodd, Huter, Jackson, and Trimble was last year's starting 5, but really it was Melo, Trimble, and the Miracles. He was the team last year. Trimble gone to the NBA. Another player has transferred. That leaves Cowan, Huter, and Jackson as the 3 guys that are left to carry the load for them. Now, the Terps do return overall about 75% of their minutes and about 70% of their scoring last year, but they're going to have to develop a go-to guy. Melo Trimble was that for Maryland last year. He was the difference maker for them in several games a year ago. Who's going to be that this winter? Next up, we look at Michigan State. And this is going to be the consensus preseason favorite. Miles Bridges said no to the NBA draft. He's coming back. Ellis, Langford, Ward, and Winston. Those were the 5 players that led them in minutes a year ago. Among those 5, 3 return, but they're the right 3. Bridges, Langford, and Winston, the 3 with the highest ceiling. And don't forget, Sparty also brings in another top 40 class. They also had some big men who were hurt last year that they expect to be on the mend and available for next season. In my view, I don't think they're the clear class of the league, but I do think they're clearly the team with the highest ceiling, particularly if Cassius Winston develops from one year to the next at the all-important point guard position. Minnesota is a team that will get a lot of preseason love. Coffey, Mason, McBrayer, Murphy, and Springs. Those were the 5 players that led them in minutes a year ago. And all but Springs, you'll recall Springs actually got hurt against Michigan in the Big Ten tournament back in March. But the key 4 players there, Coffey, Mason, McBrayer, and Murphy, Those 4 guys all are back. Minnesota's going to be a consensus top 15 team probably this fall when the magazines come out. But I will be fascinated. This is a program that hasn't really had a lot of preseason expectations going back almost 20 years. It actually has been 20 years since Clem Haskins and Bobby Jackson led them to the Final Four. They snuck up on everybody this year. Richard Pitino was on the hot seat because of how terrible they were the year prior. They improved by 9 games in the Big Ten. That's tough to do in any year. I'll be fascinated to see how they handle preseason expectations, the likes of which they haven't really had in a decade or more. And the next team we'll take a look at, Northwestern. Law, Lumpkin, Lindsey, McIntosh, they're all Big Ten point guard, and Pardon. Those were the 5 players that led them in minutes a year ago. And Law, Lindsey, McIntosh, and Pardon are back. Those top 4 guys. And I don't think Northwestern will have the problem Minnesota did, and here's why. Even though Northwestern will have more preseason expectations than they've ever had, like ever, because they are the first time, it's the first time they've ever made the NCAA tournament. But you have to think of what those kids played with last year. So many people in sports media are Northwestern grads. There was so much pressure, so much attention on them the last 4 to 5 weeks of the year to overcome those expectations. Hey, you're going to be the first ones to make the tournament. And I think when they hit that a miracle shot at the end against Michigan there at Welsh Ryan that pretty much clinched their NCAA bid, I think those kids are kind of playing with house money now. It's a little bit like the Chicago Cubs. They're not under any real pressure to repeat. The pressure was breaking a 108-year drought. All right, that's pressure, guys. Repeating after you do that, that's not really much pressure. The pressure for Northwestern was dealing with the expectations in season last year. I think Minnesota has a much bigger chip on its shoulder with an expectation burden than Northwestern does. All right, the next team we're going to take a look at, the defending Big Ten champions, Purdue, Matthias, Klein, Edwards, Vince Edwards, the other Edwards, Caleb Swanigan. Those were their starting 5 that led them in minutes a year ago. Of that 5, the only player not back, Biggie Swanigan, Big Ten Player of the Year, decided to stay in the NBA draft. Now, the bulk of his minutes, we assume, will be taken over by Jared Haas, provided he's in better physical conditioning, because he struggled to stay on the court for long stretches a year ago. That's still a pretty salty starting 5, but you know what they don't have? That one difference maker. Some of you are going to say, well, Steve, Vince Edwards can be that guy. I loved Vince Edwards last year as the number 2 guy to Caleb Swanigan. But now that he's going to be the number 1 option, who on that list right there now do you think is the number 2? And a lot of you don't really get this sometimes. It's a big difference going from the number 2 option on a team to being the number 1. Going from the guy that essentially gets to draft off the exhaust of the other guy and you can show out on teams as opposed to being the guy everybody's game planning for. It'll be fascinating to see if former Michigan recruit Vince Edwards, if he can take that leap next season, because that probably will have a lot to do with whether or not Purdue can successfully defend their Big Ten championship. And that brings us next to the Badgers of Wisconsin. What is it? An amazing streak, something like 14 years in a row. They finished in the top 4 in the league. Brown, Happ, Hayes, Koenig, Showalter, those were the 5 guys that led them in minutes last year. Of that 5, only Ethan Happ returns. My friend John Miller over at Hawkeye Nation likes to say the Greg Gard era at Wisconsin begins actually this coming year. Now that he's got to recruit and build a team, not done for him by Bo Ryan for the first time. Indeed, he does. And Ethan Happ's also going to learn life is tough when you're the lone recruit, when you're the lone returning starter and you're a big guy, and defenses will just collapse on you all night long until you prove you've got something on the perimeter. And that means we have one more team to look at. The Michigan Wolverines, Zach Irvin, Mohamed Abdur-Rahman, Mo Wagner, Derek Walton Jr., and DJ Wilson. Those were the 5 that led Michigan in minutes a year ago. Of that 5, Abdur-Rahman and Wagner return. Now, DJ Wilson had stayed. I think this could have potentially, with what Michigan has coming in from a recruiting standpoint, the addition of Simmons, the top grad transfer from Ohio U, might have been preseason MAC Player of the Year, turned down Kansas to come to Michigan. This might have been the best starting 5 of the Beeline era, and I think a top 10 kind of a team. No, I'm not saying they're as talented as a 2013 team with Stauskas and McGarry and Trey Burke and those guys. But in terms of the 5 they would have put on the floor, all fitting in the right role, it might have been John Beilein's best starting 5 and a team with a lot of size as well. Alas, DJ Wilson decided to keep his name in the draft. I still think this is a team that'll be somewhere periphery, top 25 kind of a team most of the year, and an NCAA tournament team again, that when they get into the tournament, between both Beilein's coaching and Wagner's potential to maybe take that next step, maybe he can take that Caleb Swanigan step here this coming year, they will be a dangerous, competitive basketball team again a year from now. So when you look at the Big Ten, I think Sparty clearly has the highest ceiling, but I don't think they are a clear going away favorite. But I do think the league's going to be stronger than it was a year ago. I think you're looking at 6 to 7 teams that are going to be pretty much the entire season in the top 25, or at least right there in the conversation.
That's right, and it's not quite so short as it used to be over there. Pass in the flat, intercepted, and Thompson is going to head for 6.
Look at Terry Harvey as he looks out to where he's going to throw the football. He never takes his eyes off of where he's going to throw the football. Clarence Thompson, a freshman from Martin Luther King High School in Detroit, played for Jim Reynolds, the coach up at Martin Luther King, who's a high school catcher in baseball, makes the interception, and the freshman goes in for the touchdown.
Joined this week on the Michigan podcast by Michael Spath. Some of you remember him from back in the day at the Wolverine. Now he does mid-mornings on WTKA in Ann Arbor, which is the flagship of the Michigan Sports Network. He just joined Go Blue Wolverine, which is the Scout.com Michigan site as well. And Michael, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm doing very well, man. It's been an interesting sports day and really news day the last 24 hours or so.
It has been. Before we get to it, though, for those that are watching, I mean, I've read a lot of your stuff over the years. I know the role that you and your father played and you becoming a Michigan fan and sharing this experience growing up together. How do you get from Michigan fan as a kid to Michigan student to getting paid to cover Michigan athletics? I think I speak for 99.5% of the guys in this audience that want to know, how can I get that gig, Michael?
I think you get really lucky, Steve, I got to say. I mean, when I look back on it, I caught a couple of breaks, and I know a lot of people that have been trying to get into this business that have not caught the breaks I did. I mean, when I left school in 2002, I took a job in Hillsdale, Michigan, and it just so happened that the Wolverine was looking for a reporter within 3 months of me moving to Hillsdale, Michigan. And if that wasn't the case, I might not have ever come back. I might be off in Chicago or New York or LA or something like that. But the Wolverine needed a reporter. I've been reading the Wolverine for 10 years, and I guess I just said the right things on my interview. I think I said I told the guy at the time that I'd work for free, which was, you say, 99.9% of Michigan fans out there. I think they would offer the same thing if they had a chance to cover the football team, be up in the press box, go to road games. Honestly, it was a couple of really fortunate breaks, and then you have to work your butt off. You have to be willing, especially when you're young, to work 12-hour days to cover a Michigan basketball game on a Thursday night, get home at 1 o'clock in the morning, come back and cover a Michigan hockey game till 11:30 at night, get home, wake up, go to a Michigan football game, be working for a Michigan football game all day, and then Sunday wake up and really not have any time, because then you've got to go right into recap and looking forward to the next game. So it's a ton of hard work, but I do know that there's a lot of really talented people out there that have gotten involved with podcasts such as yourself, that have been doing blogs, that are just making their presence known on Twitter. So the good news is that there's never been a greater opportunity to have some type of voice that covers Michigan football. The bad news is that at the same time as all these things are popping up, there's far fewer big time journalistic media outlets. A lot of the newspapers have gone down to one person versus 4 people. When I first started, the Detroit Free Press used to have 4 people at every single Michigan football game. Now they might have 2, a beat writer and a columnist. So it's kind of like a changing landscape. The good news is that Michigan football is as popular as it's ever been, thanks a lot to Jim Harbaugh, and college football is as popular as it's ever been. So it's not going away. So if you dream about it, just work every day for something and try to catch on with one of these blogs, one of these websites, and do anything that they say. If they say, we want you to cover a high school game in Alaska at 12 o'clock at night and be back to cover Michigan football next day, say, absolutely, I'll get on a plane.
Now, I'm about 10 years older than you, so the era that I grew up in the 80s and 90s, Michigan was one of the few schools in the country that was nationally dominant simultaneously in both football and men's basketball. You said you broke in around 2002, so you have seen a lot of really the travails and the controversies over the last decade or so, from the essentially the outpouring of what happened, the aftermath of the Ed Martin scandal and the wilderness that put the Michigan basketball program in between 1998 and 2009, when John Beilein led us back to the NCAA tournament. Of course, the controversy about will Les Miles replace Lloyd Carr or not, and will people rally to Rich Rodriguez or not, and Stretchgate, and a decade of football where we averaged barely 7 wins a season, and hey, get some tickets if you buy a Coke Zero, and we're endangering our players, all the stuff that's gone on the last decade or so. You've had a chance to cover that. How do you stay a fan, not get jaded, but at the same time do your job?
Well, I will tell you that when I was working for the Wolverine magazine, I really tried to turn the fan part of me off. Yes, I went to Michigan and I graduated from Michigan in 2002. And yes, I wanted to see Michigan football win because it was good for business. People were in a better mood. But I really tried to say, okay, let's separate a little bit of your fandom from being a journalist, and let's be a journalist first and a fan second. And then when you go home at night, if you want to have a fan moment, go for it. But at least on the message boards, in the writing I did, in radio interviews, everything I try to do professionally and look at this as an even, unbiased, even journalist. When I moved to radio, it's been a little bit different because I think especially working in Ann Arbor market and working for WTKA, which has an official relationship with Michigan, I think it allows you to say, okay, I'm going to be a little bit more of a fan than I had been in the past and give a fan's perspective on things. And at the same time, I'm now a fan probably first and a journalist second, but I've got a lot of those journalistic tendencies. I've got a lot of those journalistic qualities I learned through the years. And so I try to approach Michigan football without tinted glasses. Like even this stuff that's going on with Michigan State, I don't see this as a good thing for Michigan. This is not a benefit for Michigan. When I look at programs getting in trouble, I don't look at like how this benefits Michigan. I think about like, though, this is a bad situation. When Michigan loses a football game to Ohio State, and a lot of people complain about the officiating, I don't look at it and go, well, the fans screwed Michigan, or the referees screwed Michigan, and as a fan, I'm ticked off about this. I look and say, what could Michigan have done better in that game to make sure that it never came down to some of those plays? So I still look at things with a critical eye, but I will admit that I'm rooting for Michigan, and I have to be careful in the press box. You're still not allowed to cheer for Michigan, but 6 days out of the week, 7 days out of the week, except for that 3.5 hours I'm sitting in a Michigan press box, I am a fan.
Michael Spath from WTKA Ann Arbor and Go Blue Wolverine is our guest this week on the Michigan podcast. All right, let's transition to more of the hard news. You mentioned Michigan State. Here is the last year of their football program, Michael, 3-9. They've had 9 underclassmen leave this offseason with eligibility. Arguably, their top 4 recruits in the program gone with not one but 2 separate sexual assault investigations. One of them, he was on his own. The other 3 allegedly worked together. This is the very definition of a dumpster fire. How did it turn so quickly? Just last offseason, many of us were looking at the Michigan season as we're looking at the Ohio State game this year. We were looking at the Michigan State game as that game last year. That's the game we have to win. Doesn't matter if we're 9-3, 11-1. Can't lose to Sparty again. Got to make a statement. Should have beat them last year. Fluke loss, just like we said about Ohio State. Fluke loss last year. Fluke loss to Sparty. We got to beat them. And now here we are a year later, and I seriously don't believe Mark Dantonio will be coaching there by 2019. I think all those things working against them, the Curtis Blackwell thing, I think will be a disaster in recruiting because he's going to have to clear his name, which will drag a lot of this, I think, into the mud and the muck and the mire of the cesspool of recruiting, as you well know. How did this all go down in just a year, Michael?
That's a great question, and I'm sure Mark Dantonio is staring himself in the mirror and asking, where did I go wrong? And as best as I can tell, Steve, and I've talked to people on the Michigan State side of this, and all of them come back to recruiting in the last couple of years. And Mark Dantonio especially after that Alabama game where they played in the national semifinals and they got thumped by Alabama, and Nick Saban, Mark Dantonio kind of saying, all right, I've got to recruit. I'm now in a position to recruit a higher caliber athlete, and I've got to recruit these 4- and 5-star recruits, and I've got to bring in some of these kids that are uber talented. They're going to put me on a stage that I can compete with Alabama, and I can compete year in and year out with Ohio State and Clemson and Florida State, because that's what I want. I want to win a national championship at Michigan State. And in doing so, he kind of, what it sounds like, is went against his own personal philosophy, where he wanted to get the underrated kid, the 2-star, the 3-star, the 0-star, the kid that had been that has a massive chip on his shoulder and can't wait to play Michigan because he got overlooked by Michigan. Instead, he started recruiting the kids that Michigan recruited. He started recruiting the kids that Ohio State recruited. He started recruiting the kids that Penn State recruited. And when you start to recruit those kids and you don't you essentially don't know how to coach those kids because you're not used to their sense of entitlement. You're not used to them kind of bristling at the tough love. It changes the dynamic, and you start to go back in the last couple of recruiting classes. You know, I look at one recruit, and it's really unfair to pin it on one kid, but one recruit, Malik McDowell out of Detroit, and this is a kid that Michigan really wanted. I mean, this is a kid that Michigan would have taken in a heartbeat, but Malik McDowell seems to epitomize what went south with this Michigan State program, and that's a kid that, from everything we've heard, and if you hear it once, you can kind of dismiss it. You hear it twice, okay. When you hear it from 15 different people that were around the program, and all of them said that Malik McDowell would show up to practices and he would pull himself out of drills if he didn't feel like doing them. Malik McDowell would skip strength and conditioning. Malik McDowell will skip classes, and they kept on covering for him. Well, now the accountability goes away. Now you're treating players. Now you're letting you become a player's coach instead of the hard, tough, aggressive coach that you've been in the past. And that just starts to infiltrate the program. Now, I don't think that necessarily leads to players committing sexual assault, but what it often leads to is freshmen feeling like they deserve something they don't deserve, and then seniors resenting that, and chemistry problems. I think if you look at the 3-9 season, you had massive chemistry problems, and you had a lot of young players that were playing and thought that they deserved everything, and you had older players that had learned under the old system of Mark Dantonio, and it just became this perfect storm of a mess. And that's why then 3-9. In terms of the sexual assault, I have a hard time saying that Mark Dantonio has fostered this culture of get away with whatever you want to get away with, because that's not really who he was for about 6 to 8 years. I know people want to go back and look at Winston, that he got out of jail, but I mean, we're talking about 8-10 years ago. We're not talking about 2014 or 2013 or 2012. He really led a pretty solid program from about 2009 to 2015. And then he just seemed to maybe kind of change his spots and become a different type of coach and recruit a different type of athlete. And now it's gotten him in a lot of trouble. And now he has to hit a reset button that's going to be a lot harder to hit reset because of the culture and the climate that you're in college football nowadays. We used to say back in the day, karma's a female dog, Michael. And you go back to Mike Hart's little brother comments after Chad Henne threw the pass to Mario Manningham to beat Michigan State in 2007. And then it went several years before Michigan won a game again. And after those little brother comments, Mark Dantonio famously, quoting the Bible, said, "Pride cometh before the fall," one of the Proverbs. Well, if you go back to the Big Ten championship game when they beat Iowa, L.J. Scott scores in that 4th and goal, that tremendous run. After the game, he stands up and says, on the field there in the Fox Sports interview, he says, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I really think we have the Lord's favor. He said that after they beat Iowa in the Big Ten championship game. Since then, they are 3-10. They have had multiple scandals. That is if the little brother thing and pride cometh before the fall was karma going the green and white way back in the day, I think those comments about having the Lord's favor, I think you're seeing karma maybe swing the other way right now for Sparty. Well, and I'll tell you this, because I know a lot of people are rooting for his demise. I'm not rooting for his demise at all. I think Mark Dantonio should spend 10 more years in East Lansing, and Michigan should wipe the floor with them over those 10 years. That's what I want, because, so many people are like, well, the pride comes before the fall, and they want to. I mean, I've heard from a lot of people that I want to see, like you just said, he might be gone in 2019. I don't want to see that, Steve. because that's not how you want to treat when a guy has bullied you for a little bit. I mean, I can remember, playing basketball back in the day, and when some of my friends got a little bit better than me and they started taking it to me, and then I grew and I went up like 6 inches between my sophomore year in high school and my senior year in high school, and I got bigger and stronger again. And you know how much fun I had every single time we played again that I could beat them?
Sure.
And so why would Michigan fans want to see Mark Dantonio get kicked to the curb? Why would they want to see Michigan State go 2-10 the next couple of years and see Mark Dantonio go? I'll take them at 7-5, 8-4, as long as every single year one of those 4 losses or one of those 5 losses is to Michigan. That's what I want. I don't want to see him go away. He's too good of a coach, honestly, to see him go away. I want to see Michigan State be a good program that Michigan just stomps on every single year. That, to me, would be far greater satisfaction than watching them go in the tank.
Speaking of things changing quickly, Thad Matta out yesterday as head basketball coach at Ohio State. We spent some time in the previous segment looking at some of the key returners for Big Ten basketball coming in next year now that the NBA draft entry deadline has passed. And you talk about a guy that is going to leave with one of the, if not the greatest, depending on what your metric is, winning percentage by any Big Ten basketball coach ever. There was a streak there from about 2006 to about 2013, a couple of Final Fours, multiple Big Ten titles. And now they can't recruit, they can't retain. A lot of this, I think, with Thad Matta, really, I think it might be his health issues, Michael. I mean, he's had the back. I think he's got a foot problem. And I just think it's tough to rehab those kinds of injuries and recruit full bore at the same time. You're going to try to split the difference, and maybe both will suffer. I bet he's a guy that pulls a Huggy Bear a few years ago, takes a year or two off to get himself healthy. He's barely 50 years old. I don't think he is 50 yet. And I think he may come back with a vengeance. What do you think?
Well, that would certainly be interesting. It won't be at Ohio State. We know that. It could be at a mid-major and give him an opportunity to work his way back. I do think the health issues, he could probably benefit from not just 1 year off, but probably like 3 years off. And then it's really a question of whether someone wants to take a chance at him at that point. But, I think from Ohio State's point of view, like, they had to make this change because that program was trending in the wrong direction. And when you look at the Big Ten right now and you look at what Tom Izzo has coming back, and the fact that Tom Izzo's not going away, and you look at Maryland with Mark Turgeon, and you look at John Beilein at Michigan, and you look at now Chris Collins at Northwestern and that program rising up, and you've got Pitino, who I'm still not a big fan of Pitino, but I still think, Minnesota's doing better than they've ever done. Indiana just went and hired Archie Miller, and the Big Ten is more competitive than it's ever been in the conference, and you can't be trending in the wrong direction. And so if I'm Ohio State, I've got to go get that next guy that, as you said, it doesn't seem like he's approaching recruiting with everything he's got, all the gusto. And so they need that young guy that's going to get after it and really just kind of recruit to the level that Ohio State is capable of recruiting. I mean, the state of Ohio is known for its football recruits, but its basketball program is really good too. I mean, they have more quality and quantity basketball players. I shouldn't say quality. They have more quantity of basketball players than the state of Michigan. Michigan every year produces 4 or 5 kids that are legit kids. Ohio can produce 10 kids every year that are legit kids. And so there's an opportunity if he can keep Kentucky and Louisville and Xavier and Michigan and all these schools out of Ohio and just recruit the best players from his own state, then the Buckeyes can be really good again really fast. And that's the thing in college basketball too. You can turn it around so quickly because of 1 recruiting class, 2 recruiting classes. And I think if you're Gene Smith, you're looking and going, whether it is his health or whatever's happened at Thad Matta, he's lost his mojo, and there's no special formula to get it back. And so we got to move on because basketball is too important to the bottom line and too important to just the way that the university is perceived to be a middling basketball program. As good as our football team is, we need both.
Is there a name they could hire, Michael, that you think as a Michigan fan, oh boy, just got tougher for Coach B? Because, I mean, the whole Archie Miller thing, I never got that. I mean, he didn't do any better at Dayton than Brian Gregory did, and he was a disaster when he went there from there to Georgia Tech. Listen, it's Indiana. If you're competent, you should at least be good. But when that hire was announced a few weeks ago, I wasn't like, wow. I mean, that's a paradigm shift in the Big Ten. I didn't sense that at all, like Ohio State bringing Urban Meyer in, for example, on the football side. So is there a name they could realistically get? Like I would say maybe a Billy Donovan. Is he looking at the future that he's likely going to get fired in Oklahoma City in a year or so when Russell Westbrook leaves in free agency as well? And now he doesn't get Westbrook and Durant, he doesn't get even Westbrook. Is that a guy you go to and say, hey, especially with Urban Meyer on your staff and they were together at Florida back in the day, do you go to him and say, here's a blank check, tell us what it's going to take to get you to come back to college basketball? Is that a move if you're Ohio State?
If I'm the Buckeyes, because I think it's hard to go out there and get a college coach right now because all these guys are tied into obviously the recruiting, and they wouldn't want to leave their programs in a position where they have to go out there and hire a new coach. And even then, when you look at, like, Shaka Smart was such a guarantee, right? He was going to go to a major program, become a huge success. Now, maybe he'll still become that. But the first couple of years have not gone super well for Shaka Smart. Mm-hmm. And so you look at Archie Miller, is he going to be a huge success in Indiana? I don't know. I think you have to take a chance a little bit on getting someone from a mid-major, and maybe that's what they do. But I would go after an NBA coach. And we were talking about this on our radio show on Tuesday, and while my producer, Zach Shaw, laughed at the idea that they would go get Billy Donovan, laughed at the idea that Fred Hoiberg would leave Chicago or that Quinn Snyder would leave the Utah Jazz, at the same time, if you are one of those coaches and you look at this realistically and say, okay, I'm in the Western Conference. If Kevin Durant re-signs with Golden State and every indication is that he'll be there for a while, I ain't going to win anything for 5 years. If I'm the Chicago Bulls and I'm Fred Hoiberg and I'm looking at it and saying, well, as long as it's LeBron and Kyrie Irving and Kevin Love together, I ain't going to get past Cleveland. The best thing that any of these coaches could do might be say, I'm going to go back to college basketball for 5 years and compete and win a national championship. And you know what? In 5 years' time, LeBron James is like 38 years old. And maybe he's, worn down. Maybe he's even retired. And in 5 years, Steph Curry and Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson are a little bit getting closer to over the hill. And now I can go back and compete in the NBA. I think for the next couple of years, you have to realistically look at it and say, sure, I'm getting paid a lot of money. And sure, I want to compete at the highest level, but I can't win at the highest level in the NBA. But I can win at the highest level at Ohio State.
All right, 2 more questions before we let you go, Michael. Let's talk Michigan football. And you've been pretty adamant. I'm a regular listener to you guys' show, courtesy of the iHeartRadio app. You have been pretty adamant that you think Michigan's going to win the Big Ten in football this year, despite having 18 players now in NFL training camps when they begin here in a few weeks. That's a heck of a lot of turnover. I thought it was fascinating, though, today. I was listening to you guys talk about the amount of 4- and 5-star prospects that Michigan has recruited at all of these positions to come and take over. And we have seen Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State, Florida State. There's 4 or 5 programs right now that are recruiting at such a high clip, it almost doesn't matter who they lose. Michigan has recruited at that same rate the last 2 years, but it's only been the last 2 years. So we're talking about a lot of guys are going to be sophomores, redshirt freshmen, a couple true freshmen like Donovan Peoples-Jones and Tariq Black. So why are you so confident?
Well, I was looking at this earlier. There's 27 players that are in their 3rd year or more. So they're either redshirt sophomores, juniors, or seniors from Michigan. And is that enough? I don't know. But I'll say this. When I look at the type of athletes that Jim Harbaugh has brought in, and you combine that with players like Wilton Spate and Maurice Hurst, Mason Cole, Mike McCray, Tyree Kinnell, Ian Bunting, some of the older guys that they can rely on, Khalid Hill, I just don't think that college football, if you look at the last 3 to 5 years, it has evolved where the best kids in the country are not sticking around for 5th years. They're generally not sticking around for senior years. Most of the best kids in the country are leaving after their junior season or redshirt sophomore season if they redshirted their first year. Guys like Jabril Peppers that left after his redshirt sophomore year. And in that vein, it's become a lot, it's not want to say easier, but it's become possible for you to win with a team that is mostly 2nd and 3rd year players. Because the 4th and 5th year players are few and far between nowadays. And so I just think that when you look at Michigan's collection of talent, yes, they're young, but when you look at their collection of talent, who are they going to face this year that's going to be more talented than them? Ohio State, maybe Florida. When we discussed this on the show today, when you look at the rosters, Michigan's more talented than Florida. Michigan's more talented than Penn State. Michigan's more talented than Wisconsin. The only school is Ohio State, but they get Ohio State at home, and the sense of urgency that has to be there because you don't want to go 0-3. Jim Harbaugh doesn't go 0-3 against Urban Meyer. Is going to put so much of an emphasis on that game. I just look at it like this. It's not that I'm predicting Michigan to necessarily win the whole thing or that they're the favorite, but I asked almost a little Jim Harbaugh-esque, why not us?
Mm-hmm.
Why not Michigan? Why can't they compete? Why can't they do with what Clemson did a year ago? When Clemson beat Alabama in the national championship, they had 24 out of their 44 players on the two deep were freshman or sophomore eligibility. And then you look at this Michigan team, and by best forecast, it's going to be somewhere between 26 to 28 of the 44 players on the two deep, offensively and defensively, are going to be freshman or sophomore eligibility. That's not a big difference.
No,
and someone pointed out to me that Deshaun Watson, Michigan doesn't have a Deshaun Watson. Sure they don't. But you know what? Very few programs have a Deshaun Watson.
Mm-hmm.
Michigan does have a third-year player in Harbaugh's system, a redshirt junior quarterback, and he's got to be a difference maker.
Finally, Michael, you've been so gracious with your time this week here on the Michigan podcast. We appreciate it. For the fans, as a guy who's been a fan, still is, but has now been on the inside covering the team, what is the number one thing we get wrong?
Wow. I hate to say this, but I think I won't go down that road. I think the biggest complaint that I hear a lot on social media and listening to people on message boards is when Michigan loses a game and people say, well, they don't have any heart. They didn't come to compete. How could they not come to compete? How do they not have any heart? These guys are playing soft. That is complete and utter BS. These players have so much more heart and they care so much more, and they are not soft. The idea that these players are soft when they give their bodies and they give their minds and they give up their free time and they give up everything 365 days a year, and they do it for 4 or 5 years while they're in college, and fans sit up there in the crowd and they're disappointed with the performance, and so they say those guys were not mentally ready. They didn't show up for this game. They don't have any heart. I hate that. I hate that because I guarantee you this. Anybody that says that they don't have heart, go down on the sideline and feel the vibe of that team, or lace up, put a winged helmet on, put some cleats on, put some pads on, and you go down there and you get on the line of scrimmage, and then you try to tell those guys that they don't have any heart, that they don't care about winning that football game. I think that is the most utterly ridiculous comment that I hear year after year. Anytime that Michigan starts off slow in a game, anytime that Michigan plays down to competition, when they played Indiana last year, when they played Iowa, these guys don't have any heart. These guys are not ready for this game. This is despicable. This is pathetic. How could Michigan show up like this? No, the only thing that's pathetic is that commentary.
I think Spath just went Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in airplane on us. Hey, you go back there and tell your old man to carry Bill Walton up and down the court all night long. Well done, Mike. It's been a pleasure having you with us, and you do great work. Love you guys' show. Thanks for being with us on the Michigan Podcast.
Anytime, Steve. I had a lot of fun. Thank you so much, and good luck to you going forward here.
I appreciate it. Take care. We'll come back. More in a moment.
All right, Becky, thanks very much. The ball is at the 47 of Indiana. It's the first time in the ball game that Michigan has started a possession on the Indiana side of the field. They lead 10-6. Here comes the reverse. McMurtry's going to set up and throw, and Callaway is wide open. Touchdown! In baseball by the Red Sox a couple of years ago, but wanted to come to school to get an education. Can also throw the football. Callaway makes the catch. Play only took 9 seconds, and Indiana now has a problem.
And now this week's Twitter poll results here on the Michigan Podcast. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. We asked you, what is your favorite annual college football preview? 12% of you said the Sporting News preview, which is now Streets and Smiths. 12% of you said the Wolverines football preview devoted to Michigan every year, which is phenomenal. That's the one I probably would have voted for. 24% of you said Athlons, who we featured last week in their 50th anniversary issue this year, is top-notch. 52% of you said Phil Steele. God bless Phil. He has turned being a football nerd into a cottage industry. Got to love a guy like that. Let's get to this week's question of the week from one of our listeners/viewers. And our question of the week comes from Devin Baum via Twitter. He asked, Donovan Peoples-Jones came in as the receiver with the biggest hype, yet we're hearing more about Tariq Black. Is that an indication that Black is that good or that DPJ is underperforming? Well, guys, Donovan Peoples-Jones looks like he walked right out of Central Casting. All right, he looks like, Zeus and Jupiter got together to chisel out a football player. So I wouldn't worry about him underperforming. He's been on campus for 5 months. Well, let's cut him a little bit of slack. I think it's more about Tariq Black was underrated as a recruit, is showing out. His route runnings may be more advanced than was thought, and maybe can do a thing or two in the red zone right now that Donovan Peoples-Jones, just developmental-wise, isn't there yet. And that's something Michigan's lacking in their receiver. So I would not look at it as a detriment at all. I would look at it as a benefit because with the head he has on his shoulders, the coaching he'll get in Ann Arbor, and the physique that he brings with him to college as well, it's just a matter of time before Donovan Peoples-Jones lives up to the hype.
Oh, and for the Wolverines and their fans, here it is. Lobs it. Hayes is there. Out of the end zone. Touchdown. They give it to him. He had 1 foot in. He's got it. 4th down. Scotty drives back. Has pulled it out. This baby's over. That is the biggest comeback in Michigan football history. They were down to Virginia 17-0.
And now some final words of wisdom from Coach Harbaugh, except it's actually our former All-American tight end Jake Butt doing his own take on words of wisdom from Coach Harbaugh.
I truly believe the #1 natural steroid is sleep. And the #2 natural steroid is milk, whole milk. And 3 would be water. 4 would be steak. I take a vitamin every day. It's called a steak. The football gods have provided us heat and sun to shape the body and carve the mind. Losing leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and there's only one mouthwash: winning. I drink a lot of milk, whole milk though. Not that candy-ass 2% or skim milk. If worms had machine guns, then birds would be scared of them. I think that's just a lot of gobble gobble turkey. Just gobble 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 turkey from jive turkey gobblers. I think that paints a pretty good picture. Attack each day with an enthusiasm unknown to mankind. I was and still am happier than a pig in slop. I own other pants. It's gotten to the point where I save so much time a day knowing that I don't have to stand in front of the closet trying to decide what outfit to pick out. About 15 to 20 minutes a day. That adds up day after day. That's kind of the way the pickle squirted this year.
That's kind of the way the pickle squirted here on the Michigan podcast as well. And remember, losing leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and the only mouthwash is winning. We'll see you next week right here on the Michigan podcast. God bless.